Millions of years ago, humanity stood at a crossroads no one could see. Long before cities, kingdoms, or even farming existed, a generation of people lived through one of the most important turning points in human history. They were the last humans who knew only a world of hunting, gathering, and constant movement. They had no idea that everything was about to change forever. Tonight we travel back to meet the last generation before farming transformed the human story. Who were they? How did they live? And what was lost when humanity settled down? Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more journeys into the forgotten chapters of our ancient past. Now let's step back into a world on the edge of a revolution that would reshape civilization forever. The world is changing, but almost nobody alive can see the full shape of it. Across valleys, coastlines, riverbanks, and open grasslands, small bands of people move through landscapes that their ancestors have known for thousands of years. They follow migrating animals. They gather nuts, fruits, roots, shellfish, and seeds. They read the seasons with extraordinary precision. A shift in the wind, the flowering of a certain plant, the arrival of a particular bird, each detail carries meaning. Entire calendars exist without writing. Entire libraries exist without books. Yet hidden within these familiar rhythms is a transformation that will eventually reshape nearly every human life on Earth. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a few communities are beginning to spend more time in one place. Certain plants are receiving unusual attention. Wild grains are being harvested in larger quantities. Storage pits are appearing. Villages are growing. What begins as an experiment, perhaps barely noticed at first, will become one of the most consequential changes in human history. For now, however, most people still belong to another world. They are the last generation before farming. To understand them requires setting aside many modern assumptions. Agriculture often appears inevitable when viewed from the present. Cities, kingdoms, writing systems, roads, monuments, and eventually industrial societies all emerge from agricultural foundations. Looking backward, it is tempting to imagine farming as an obvious improvement waiting to happen. The archaeological record tells a more complicated story. For most of human existence, nobody farms. Anatomically, modern humans emerge roughly 300,000 years ago. Agriculture appears only within the last 12,000 years. This means that more than 95% of human history unfolds without fields, ploughs, or domesticated crops. Generation after generation survives through hunting, gathering, fishing, trapping, and deep ecological knowledge. These people are not primitive failures waiting to become farmers. They are remarkably successful. The evidence survives in fragments. Stone tools lie buried beneath layers of sediment. Animal bones accumulate in ancient campsites. Shell middens rise beside coastlines. Charred seeds rest within forgotten hearths. Together, these clues reveal societies that are often flexible, adaptable, and surprisingly resilient. Many hunter-gatherer communities work fewer hours than agricultural societies that come later. Food sources are diverse. Mobility provides options during difficult seasons. If one region becomes less productive, groups can often move elsewhere. Life is not easy. Infant mortality remains high. Injury can be deadly. Drought, storms, and disease are constant threats. Yet the image of endless struggle, sometimes projected onto prehistoric peoples, does not fully match the evidence. What survives in the record suggests something more balanced. The last generation before farming inherits thousands of generations of accumulated knowledge. Every landscape contains invisible pathways of understanding. People know where water emerges during dry seasons. They know which plants become edible only after careful preparation. They know migration routes followed by animals long before recorded history. Knowledge is wealth. Knowledge is security. Knowledge is survival. In some regions, individuals can identify hundreds of useful species. They understand ecosystems in ways that modern specialists often find astonishing. Their lives depend on close observation, and observation becomes a cultural skill passed between generations. A child born into one of these communities enters a world rich with information. The lessons begin immediately. Tracks pressed into mud reveal the passage of animals. Broken branches indicate recent movement. Changes in bird behavior may signal approaching predators. The shape of clouds suggests weather patterns. The position of stars guides travel. None of this is written down. Everything lives in memory. Across enormous stretches of time, human societies perfect this way of living. The Ice Age has dominated much of recent prehistory. Vast glaciers once cover large portions of the northern hemisphere. Sea levels sit dramatically lower than today. Entire landscapes that now lie beneath oceans remain dry land. Then the climate begins to warm. The great ice sheets retreat. Rivers change course. Forests spread into former tundra. Coastlines shift as rising seas flood ancient territories. Animals move into new habitats. Humans adapt once again. Adaptation has always been humanity's greatest strength. The people living during this transitional era are descendants of countless survivors. Their ancestors endure ice ages, volcanic eruptions, shifting climates and migrations across continents. They cross mountains, deserts, and exposed land bridges. They occupy environments ranging from Arctic coastlines to tropical forests. No single lifestyle defines them all. Some depend heavily on fishing. Others pursue large game. Some gather enormous quantities of plant foods. Others combine many strategies. This diversity becomes one reason farming does not appear everywhere at once. If a hunting and gathering system works well, there may be little reason to replace it. Archaeologists increasingly recognize that the transition to agriculture is not a straightforward story of progress. In many cases, hunter-gatherers enjoy varied diets. Their nutrition can exceed that of some early farming populations. Early agricultural communities often become dependent on a limited number of crops. Crop failures can create serious risks. The first farmers do not immediately live better lives. In some regions, evidence suggests they work harder. Their skeletons sometimes show signs of repetitive labor. Diets can become less varied. Certain diseases spread more easily within larger, denser settlements. Scholars still debate exactly why agriculture ultimately becomes so widespread. No single explanation fully accounts for this transformation. The mystery becomes even more fascinating when viewed from the perspective of those standing on its threshold. Imagine a person born around 11,000 years ago in the Near East, one of several regions where agriculture will eventually emerge. That individual enters a world that feels ancient and familiar. Elders teach skills inherited across thousands of years. Seasonal movements continue. Wild resources remain central to survival. Nothing announces that history is approaching a turning point. There is no sign declaring the arrival of a new age. No prophecy predicts villages, kingdoms, empires, and cities. The future remains invisible. Yet subtle changes are already underway. Certain wild cereals attract attention because they can be harvested efficiently. Grinding stones become increasingly common in some communities. Food storage expands. Populations slowly grow. Settlements become larger than those known in earlier periods. Each development seems small on its own. Together they begin forming a new pattern. Archaeology rarely captures moments of realization. It records traces rather than thoughts. Researchers uncover buildings, tools, seeds, bones, and burials. Human intentions remain harder to see. The evidence remains incomplete. Even so, a remarkable picture emerges. The last generation before farming occupies a unique position in human history. They inherit an ancient world shaped by mobility, ecological knowledge, and wild landscapes. Their children or grandchildren may witness the first stages of something entirely different. Few people understand that they are living at the edge of one of humanity's greatest transitions. Most simply continue their daily routines. They gather food beside rivers. They repair tools. They share stories around fires. They teach children the skills needed to survive. Above them, the same stars shine that guided countless ancestors. Below their feet, however, the foundations of a new world are quietly forming. The age of hunters and gatherers has endured for hundreds of thousands of years. It appears permanent, it appears natural, it appears inseparable from what it means to be human, and that is precisely what makes the coming transformation so extraordinary. For the first time in scattered places across the world, people are beginning to alter the relationship between humans and the living landscape itself. The consequences will echo through every civilization yet to come. But before fields spread across valleys and before villages grow into towns, the old world still holds. For one brief moment in history, humanity stands balanced between two ways of life, with one foot planted firmly in the deep past, and the other unknowingly reaching toward the future. The old world is far richer than it appears. From a modern perspective, it is easy to imagine hunter-gatherers living in constant scarcity, endlessly searching for food in unforgiving landscapes. The image has endured for centuries, reinforced by assumptions that civilization begins only when people settle down and cultivate the land. Yet the archaeological evidence increasingly reveals a different reality. For many communities living before agriculture, the natural world provides an abundance that is difficult for modern societies to fully appreciate. The last generation before farming inherits not a barren wilderness, but a planet overflowing with life. Along coastlines, immense shellfish beds stretch for kilometers. Rivers teem with fish during seasonal runs. Wetlands attract countless birds. Forests produce nuts, fruits, mushrooms, and edible roots. Grasslands support herds of grazing animals. In many regions, people move through landscapes that function almost like vast natural supermarkets, though their productivity depends entirely upon knowledge accumulated over generations. Food is rarely found by chance. Every successful meal reflects experience. A skilled forager knows precisely when a certain fruit reaches peak ripeness. Hunters understand how seasonal weather influences animal movement. Fishers recognize subtle changes in currents and water temperatures. Gathering expeditions follow calendars that exist only in memory. To outsiders unfamiliar with the environment, these landscapes might appear empty. To those who know them, they are filled with opportunity. Archaeologists often discover evidence of this abundance in surprising places. Ancient campsites contain remains from dozens of different plant and animal species. Shell middens grow into enormous mounds, sometimes accumulating over centuries. Grinding stones reveal extensive processing of seeds and nuts. Bone fragments indicate access to fish birds, small mammals, and large game. Rather than relying on a single food source, many hunter-gatherer groups maintain remarkably diverse diets. This diversity becomes a form of insurance. If one resource fails, others remain available. If drought affects a particular plant, fish populations may still provide food. If hunting becomes difficult, stored nuts or dried foods may help bridge the gap. This strategy is not always perfect, but it often proves resilient. Along the shores of ancient lakes and rivers, communities sometimes gather in places that become seasonal centers of activity. Families arrive from surrounding regions. Knowledge is exchanged. Marriages are arranged. Ceremonies take place. Resources harvested during favorable seasons support gatherings far larger than ordinary bands. These occasions remind us that prehistoric people do not live in isolation. Social networks stretch across surprisingly large distances. Stone used to make tools occasionally travels hundreds of kilometers from its source. Marine shells appear far inland. Pigments, ornaments, and crafted objects move through exchange systems that connect communities separated by mountains, deserts, and forests. The world before farming is not a collection of disconnected groups wandering aimlessly across empty landscapes. It is a world of relationships. Many of those relationships are invisible today because they leave few traces in the archaeological record. Yet scattered evidence suggests complex social ties extending across entire regions. What survives in the record hints at systems of cooperation that help communities endure difficult times. A group facing temporary shortages may seek assistance from relatives living elsewhere. Seasonal gatherings reinforce alliances. Shared traditions create bonds that extend beyond immediate family connections. In some ways, social networks become as important as food itself. The importance of these networks becomes especially clear when environments fluctuate. Even during the relatively stable climate conditions that follow the last ice age, local challenges remain common. Floods, droughts, harsh winters, and disease outbreaks can disrupt normal patterns of life. Communities survive not only because they understand nature, but because they depend upon one another. This social dimension often receives less attention than hunting or gathering, yet it may be one of the greatest strengths of pre-agricultural societies. At the same time, abundance does not mean comfort in the modern sense. Life remains physically demanding. People walk enormous distances throughout their lives. Tools must be crafted and maintained. Shelter requires continual attention. Food preparation consumes significant time. Injuries occur frequently. A broken bone, infected wound, or severe illness can become life-threatening. Yet skeletal remains sometimes reveal something unexpected. Many hunter-gatherers appear relatively healthy compared to some of the agricultural populations that follow them. Researchers studying ancient skeletons have identified periods where the introduction of farming coincides with reductions in average height signs of nutritional stress and increased evidence of disease. Early agriculture eventually supports larger populations, but the transition itself is not always beneficial for individual health. The contrast challenges long-standing assumptions about progress. The last generation before farming does not necessarily view its own way of life as inadequate. Indeed, many people likely see little reason to change. A skilled hunter living near productive wetlands may have access to reliable food throughout much of the year. A coastal community harvesting fish and shellfish may thrive without cultivating crops. Forest dwellers familiar with seasonal resources may enjoy diets containing dozens of different foods. Why abandon a system that works? This question sits at the heart of one of history's greatest mysteries. Scholars still debate why agriculture emerges when and where it does. The answer may vary from region to region. In some places, environmental changes create pressure. In others, population growth plays a role. Elsewhere, cultural innovation appears significant. No single explanation fully accounts for the global transition. What becomes increasingly clear, however, is that farming is not adopted because hunter-gatherers universally fail. Many are successful precisely because they understand how to live within productive ecosystems. One striking example comes from regions rich in wild cereals. Long before domestication, people harvest naturally occurring grains in substantial quantities. They use sickles, grinding stones, and storage facilities. Entire communities may rely heavily on resources that resemble later agricultural crops. The boundary between gathering and farming is often far less distinct than it first appears. Human beings are already shaping their environments long before formal agriculture emerges. They burn vegetation to encourage desirable plant growth. They influence animal populations through hunting practices. They selectively gather certain species. Over time, these actions subtly alter ecosystems. The relationship between humans and nature is never entirely passive. Even so, the world remains fundamentally wild. Great forests cover vast territories. Rivers flow according to natural cycles. Herds migrate across open landscapes. Predators remain powerful competitors. Human populations, though growing, are still tiny compared to those of later agricultural civilizations. At night, darkness dominates. Artificial light comes only from fires and the moon. The stars appear with extraordinary clarity. The Milky Way stretches overhead brighter than most modern people will ever witness. children grow up learning landscapes rather than maps. Their mental geography consists of valleys, hills, water sources, migration routes, sacred places, and seasonal camps. Every feature carries stories. Every story carries knowledge. The landscape itself becomes a living archive. Generations preserve information not through writing but through memory ritual and repeated experience. A particular hill may mark a hunting ground used by ancestors. A river crossing may contain stories stretching back centuries. Certain caves or rock shelters may hold special significance long before agriculture arrives. The old world possesses depth. It possesses history. It possesses meaning. Yet beneath this apparent stability, subtle forces are beginning to accumulate. Populations are slowly increasing. Certain resource-rich regions are attracting more people. Competition for valuable territories occasionally grows. Communities spend longer periods in favored locations. Storage becomes more important. The seeds of transformation are being planted even before anyone deliberately plants a crop. For now, however, the abundance of the wild still defines daily life. The last generation before farming wakes each morning in a world where survival depends not upon fields and harvests, but upon understanding the rhythms of nature itself. Their success rests upon observation, mobility, cooperation, and knowledge refined across countless generations. It is a way of life that has carried humanity through nearly all of its history, and it remains strong enough that few can imagine how dramatically it will soon begin to change. Success creates its own challenges. For thousands upon thousands of years, human populations remain relatively small. Groups spread across immense territories. Vast stretches of land separate one community from another. Movement provides flexibility. If resources decline in one place, people often have the option of relocating. The world after the last ice age gradually begins to alter that balance. Temperatures rise, glaciers retreat, forests expand into regions once dominated by open tundra. Rivers stabilize into more predictable patterns. Wetlands flourish. Many environments become extraordinarily productive. In numerous parts of the world, people find themselves living amid landscapes capable of supporting larger populations than ever before. This is good news, at least at first. When food becomes more reliable, more children survive. Communities can remain in favorable locations for longer periods. Seasonal camps grow larger. Networks expand. Over generations, the number of people slowly increases. No one notices a crisis emerging, because there is no crisis yet. A child born into one generation experiences only a slightly more crowded world than their grandparents knew. The difference appears small. Then the next generation grows up with slightly more people again. The process unfolds gradually enough that few recognize its long-term implications. Archaeologists studying this period often observe evidence of demographic expansion. Settlement sites become more numerous. Some camps are occupied repeatedly across centuries. Resource-rich regions attract growing concentrations of people. The change is slow, but it is relentless. Human beings have become exceptionally skilled at surviving. The problem is that successful survival eventually places new demands upon the landscape. Imagine a productive river valley filled with fish, birds, edible plants, and game animals. For generations, a modest population can harvest these resources without significantly reducing them. The system remains stable. As population grows, however, the same resources must support more people. Initially, communities respond through familiar strategies. Hunting becomes more organized. Gathering becomes more intensive. Fishing technologies improve. Knowledge continues to accumulate. These adaptations help, but they do not eliminate fundamental limits. A forest can produce only so many nuts. A river can support only so many fish. A grassland can sustain only so many grazing animals before populations begin to decline. The evidence for these pressures emerges in subtle ways. At some archaeological sites, researchers notice changes in the animals being consumed. Earlier communities often focus on large game species. Later layers reveal increasing reliance on smaller animals. The shift is significant. Large prey generally provide greater returns for hunting effort. When communities begin targeting smaller species more frequently, it may indicate changing availability of traditional resources. The same pattern appears in aquatic environments. Large fish become less common in some archaeological deposits. Smaller species increase. Shellfish harvesting intensifies. Communities broaden their diets to include resources previously used less extensively. This phenomenon is sometimes called resource intensification. Rather than depending upon a few highly productive food sources, people begin extracting more value from a wider range of plants and animals. The strategy works. For a time, yet it often requires more labor, more hours spent gathering, more effort processing food, more attention devoted to managing limited resources. Without realizing it, some communities are already moving toward a future in which food production will increasingly replace food collection. The transition remains invisible because nobody intends to invent agriculture. People are simply responding to circumstances. The archaeological record suggests that many innovations emerge in exactly this way. Rarely does an individual wake up and decide to transform civilization. Most historical changes begin as practical responses to immediate challenges. A community stores more food because seasonal shortages become concerning. People harvest wild grains more intensively because they are abundant and predictable. Settlements remain occupied longer because nearby resources remain valuable. Each decision makes sense on its own. Only centuries later does the larger pattern become visible. Population growth affects social relationships as well. In smaller groups, disputes can often be resolved through separation. If tensions become severe, families may move elsewhere. Mobility acts as a pressure release valve. Larger populations complicate this solution. Desirable territories become increasingly important. Access to water sources matters more. Control over fishing grounds or gathering areas gains significance. Competition, while still difficult to detect archaeologically, may become more common. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars continue debating the extent of prehistoric conflict. Yet some sites contain signs of interpersonal violence. Skeletal injuries, defensive structures, and occasional mass burials hint that competition sometimes produces serious consequences. Most communities likely remain cooperative most of the time. Even so, growing populations create new social realities. People can no longer assume that empty land always lies beyond the next horizon. This change may be among the most important developments of the era. For countless generations, movement provides solutions to many problems. Now, in some regions, movement becomes less effective because neighboring territories are already occupied. The landscape is becoming socially crowded. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough to matter. One of the most fascinating clues comes from settlements that begin lasting longer than traditional seasonal camps. Archaeologists discover evidence of structures repeatedly rebuilt in the same locations. Communities return year after year. Certain places acquire increasing importance. A settlement occupied continuously for decades creates a very different experience from a temporary camp. People develop stronger attachments to specific locations. Infrastructure accumulates. Storage facilities become worthwhile investments. Knowledge becomes tied not only to ecosystems but also to particular places. The roots of permanence begin to grow. The irony is striking. The last generation before farming often remains composed of hunter-gatherers, yet many are already living differently from their distant ancestors. They still hunt. They still gather. They still depend upon wild resources. But some are spending longer periods in fixed locations, exploiting local resources more intensively than previous generations. The distinction may seem subtle. Historically, it is enormous. Throughout this period, climate stability also plays a critical role. Compared with the dramatic fluctuations of the Ice Age, the early Holocene offers relatively predictable conditions in many regions. Predictability encourages investment. When environmental conditions remain stable year after year, storing food makes more sense. Remaining near productive habitats becomes more attractive. Experimenting with resource management becomes less risky. The landscape itself is encouraging new possibilities. Nobody can yet foresee where those possibilities will lead. A family harvesting wild grain does not know that future civilizations will depend upon domesticated crops descended from plants like these. A community storing surplus food does not imagine future cities containing millions of inhabitants. A village growing larger each generation does not foresee kingdoms, bureaucracies, armies, and written laws. History is moving quietly. The people living through it remain focused on immediate concerns: winter preparations, tool maintenance, food collection, childcare, seasonal travel. The ordinary routines of daily life continue. Yet beneath those routines, powerful forces are gathering. Population growth is altering relationships between people and resources. Crowding is changing relationships between neighboring communities. Longer settlement is changing relationships between people and place. These transformations do not arrive as dramatic events. They accumulate slowly year after year, generation after generation. That gradual pace makes them difficult to notice. It also makes them extraordinarily powerful. By the time the consequences become clear, humanity will already be moving toward a fundamentally different way of life. The wild world remains abundant. The old traditions remain strong. The knowledge inherited from countless ancestors still guides daily survival. But the balance that has sustained hunter-gatherer societies for millennia is beginning to shift. And once that shift begins, it becomes increasingly difficult to stop. The change does not begin in the fields. It begins in the sky. For hundreds of thousands of years, human beings live through a world of extraordinary climatic instability. During the Ice Age, temperatures rise and fall dramatically. Vast glaciers advance across continents and then retreat. Rainfall patterns shift. Entire ecosystems appear and disappear. Landscapes that support abundant wildlife during one era may become inhospitable during another. Humanity survives because it adapts. Mobility becomes one of its greatest advantages. When environments change, people move. When animals migrate, hunters follow. When drought affects one region, communities seek opportunities elsewhere. The world is unpredictable, but humans become masters of flexibility. Then something unusual happens. Around 11,700 years ago, Earth enters a period known as the Holocene. The great climatic turbulence of the Ice Age largely subsides. Temperatures become comparatively stable. Seasonal cycles grow more predictable. Environmental conditions settle into patterns that can persist across generations. The significance of this change is difficult to overstate. For the first time in human history, large populations experience a world that behaves in relatively consistent ways year after year. Predictability changes everything. A hunter-gatherer living during a highly unstable climate cannot easily invest in a single location. Resources may vanish, habitats may shift, rivers may change course, mobility remains essential. A hunter-gatherer living in a stable environment encounters different possibilities. If wild cereals grow reliably in the same valley each year, harvesting them becomes more attractive. If fish runs occur predictably, communities may remain nearby for longer periods. If food sources can be anticipated with confidence, storage becomes increasingly useful. The landscape begins rewarding permanence. Archaeologists have spent decades examining this relationship between climate stability and the rise of agriculture. The connection appears strong, though scholars still debate the precise mechanisms involved. No single explanation fully accounts for the transformation. Yet one fact remains difficult to ignore. Agriculture emerges only after the world becomes significantly more stable than it had been during most of human prehistory. This does not mean the climate suddenly becomes calm everywhere. Far from it. Droughts still occur, floods still devastate communities, storms remain dangerous, environmental change continues to shape human lives. But compared with the dramatic oscillations of earlier millennia, the Holocene offers a remarkable degree of consistency. For people living through the transition, the difference is subtle because they have no previous era with which to compare it. Their grandparents may remember slightly different conditions. Their ancestors may carry stories of environmental shifts, yet few can comprehend the immense climatic instability that dominated much of the Ice Age. The world simply feels normal, and normal is precisely what makes it revolutionary. Across parts of the Near East, one of the regions where agriculture will eventually emerge, environmental conditions support extensive stands of wild cereals. Species such as wild wheat and barley flourish naturally. These plants have existed for countless generations, but now human communities are interacting with them in increasingly intensive ways. The relationship remains one of harvesting, not farming. At least for now. People collect seeds from naturally occurring stands. They use sickles fitted with stone blades. Grinding stones process grains into usable food. Storage facilities help preserve valuable resources between seasons. The evidence survives in archaeological sites scattered across the region. Researchers uncover stone tools polished by repeated grain harvesting. They find grinding equipment worn smooth through years of use. Charred plant remains reveal which species people collect and consume. Taken together, these clues suggest that wild grains are becoming increasingly important, not because anyone plans to domesticate them, simply because they are useful. The story unfolds similarly in other parts of the world, though with different plants and different local conditions. Human communities begin paying closer attention to resources that offer reliable returns. Certain environments become particularly attractive because they provide concentrated food supplies. These landscapes function almost like natural food factories. Without human cultivation, they generate enormous quantities of edible material. The temptation to remain nearby grows stronger. Climate stability also influences population distribution. As ecosystems become more productive, people gather in regions capable of supporting larger numbers. Settlements increase in size, seasonal occupations lengthen, communities return repeatedly to favoured locations. The archaeological record preserves these developments with surprising clarity. Sites occupied briefly in earlier periods sometimes evolve into places used continuously for generations. Layers of debris accumulate, structures are rebuilt, burials appear, evidence of long-term attachment becomes increasingly visible. People are beginning to stay. That simple fact carries profound consequences. Remaining in one place changes how communities think about resources. A mobile group can leave behind depleted areas and seek opportunities elsewhere. A settled community must pay closer attention to local conditions. It must understand not only how to find food, but how to ensure food remains available in the future. This shift encourages a different relationship with the environment. The line between harvesting and managing resources begins to blur. Researchers studying ancient plant remains occasionally discover signs that humans may already be influencing the abundance of certain species before true agriculture appears. By repeatedly collecting desirable plants, clearing competing vegetation, or encouraging growth near settlements, people unintentionally shape ecosystems. The changes are small, almost invisible, yet they matter. Humans are becoming active participants in environmental processes rather than merely observers. The transformation remains gradual enough that nobody notices its historical significance. A family gathering grain from a productive valley sees only food. A community storing surplus harvest sees only security. A settlement occupied year after year sees only familiarity. The larger consequences lie far beyond the horizon. At the same time, climate stability is not an uninterrupted blessing. Toward the end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of the Holocene, a sudden climatic event known as the Younger Dryas temporarily disrupts warming trends in many regions. conditions become cooler and drier. Environmental systems experience stress. Scholars continue debating exactly how this episode influences the origins of agriculture. Some researchers argue that environmental pressure encourages experimentation with food production. Others believe the relationship is more complex. The evidence remains incomplete. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that climate fluctuations interact with population growth, resource management, and cultural innovation in ways that are difficult to separate. No single cause explains what happens next. History rarely operates through simple mechanisms. Instead, multiple forces converge. Climate creates opportunities. Population growth creates pressures. Settlements encourage permanence. Resource management becomes increasingly important. Together, these developments form a web of interconnected changes. One thread alone cannot transform the world. All of them combined can. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this era is how ordinary it appears to those living through it. Children continue learning traditional skills. Hunters still track game. Gatherers still collect wild foods. Stories still pass from one generation to the next. The old world remains alive. Its rhythms continue. Its traditions endure. Nothing about daily life suggests that humanity is approaching one of the greatest turning points in its existence, and yet the conditions that will make farming possible are quietly taking shape. The climate has settled enough to reward long-term investment. The environment has become productive enough to support larger communities. Human populations have grown large enough to place increasing demands on local resources. Knowledge has accumulated to extraordinary levels. The pieces are slowly moving into position. No one sees the entire picture. No one understands where these developments will ultimately lead. But beneath the calm surface of a more stable world, history is gathering momentum. The last generation before farming still belongs to the age of hunters and gatherers. Their children may inherit something very different. The first villages do not begin with farmers. They begin with people who discover reasons to stay. For most of human history, movement defines survival. Communities follow seasonal opportunities across landscapes that change throughout the year. A river rich in fish during spring may become less useful later. Herds migrate. Fruits ripen and disappear. Different resources become available at different times. Mobility is not merely a strategy. It is a way of understanding the world. Yet as the climate stabilizes and certain regions become extraordinarily productive, some communities begin spending more time in favored locations. What starts as repeated seasonal occupation slowly evolves into something new. The transformation is so gradual that nobody recognizes it as revolutionary. One generation returns to the same valley every year. The next generation remains slightly longer. The generation after that constructs more substantial shelters. Over centuries, temporary camps begin acquiring the characteristics of villages. Archaeologists uncover evidence of this transition across several regions, but nowhere is it more striking than in parts of the Near East during the period leading up to agriculture. Here communities establish settlements that challenge traditional assumptions about hunter-gatherer life. These people still depend primarily on wild resources. They still hunt. They still gather. Yet they are no longer constantly moving. One of the most remarkable examples emerges at sites associated with what archaeologists call the Natufian culture, which flourishes roughly 15,000 to 11,000 years ago in parts of the Levant. The people living in these settlements remain hunter-gatherers, but their way of life differs significantly from that of many earlier populations. They build substantial structures. They create storage facilities. They bury their dead near settlements. They return to the same places repeatedly, sometimes for generations. The archaeological evidence reveals communities developing deeper attachments to specific locations than many of their ancestors ever experienced. This attachment changes human life in subtle but powerful ways. A mobile camp leaves little behind. A village accumulates history. Each generation adds new layers to the same place. Structures are repaired and rebuilt, pathways become established, burial grounds acquire meaning, memories become anchored to particular locations, place itself becomes part of identity. This development may seem obvious to modern people, most of whom spend much of their lives in fixed locations. For the last generation before farming, however, it represents a significant shift in perspective. The village becomes more than shelter. It becomes a center of social life. Children grow up surrounded by familiar landmarks. Elders remain connected to places associated with ancestors. Daily routines become tied to local geography in increasingly permanent ways. The consequences extend far beyond architecture. As settlements grow, new forms of social organization emerge. Larger populations require greater coordination. Shared spaces must be maintained. Resources need management. Disputes become more difficult to resolve simply by leaving. Hunter-gatherer societies have always possessed social complexity, but larger settlements introduce challenges that mobility once helped avoid. The archaeological record provides tantalizing glimpses of these changes. Some burials contain ornaments or objects that suggest differences in status or social roles. Certain structures appear larger or more elaborate than others. Communal buildings may indicate collective activities involving substantial numbers of people. The evidence remains incomplete. Scholars still debate exactly how these communities organize themselves. What survives in the record suggests increasing complexity, but many details remain uncertain. Even so, one pattern appears repeatedly. As settlements become more permanent, human relationships become more intertwined. Neighbors interact constantly. Shared responsibilities increase. Community identity grows stronger. The village encourages a different way of thinking about both people and resources. Storage becomes particularly important. For mobile groups, carrying large quantities of food is impractical. Settled communities enjoy new possibilities. Surplus resources can be accumulated. Harvested foods can be preserved. Supplies can be stored for future use. This innovation may appear simple. Its implications are enormous. Stored food creates security against shortages. It also creates wealth. For perhaps the first time in human history, substantial resources can remain concentrated in specific locations for extended periods. A storage pit filled with grain represents more than food. It represents future survival. It represents labor invested in advance. It represents something worth protecting. As storage expands, communities become increasingly connected to the places where their resources are kept. Leaving becomes more costly. Staying becomes more attractive. The roots of sedentary life deepen. Another important change accompanies permanent settlement. Waste accumulates. This may sound trivial, but archaeologists recognize it as one of the defining characteristics of village life. Temporary camps leave relatively little debris. Long-term settlements generate enormous amounts. Animal bones pile up. Broken tools accumulate. Ash layers thicken. Discarded materials create archaeological deposits that grow year after year. The very existence of these deposits reveals how profoundly daily life is changing. People are no longer simply passing through. They are living in place. The environment surrounding settlements also begins to transform. Repeated harvesting affects local plant communities. Hunting influences nearby animal populations. Firewood collection alters vegetation patterns. Human activity becomes a significant ecological force. Not intentionally, not systematically, but increasingly visible nonetheless. The relationship between people and landscape is becoming more intimate. A hunter moving constantly through vast territories experiences nature differently from someone who spends years in a single valley. The settled community pays closer attention to local conditions. It notices patterns. It develops preferences. It may even begin influencing those patterns in subtle ways. Some researchers argue that this growing familiarity with local ecosystems helps lay the foundation for later agricultural experimentation. The idea is difficult to prove conclusively, yet it carries a certain logic. People who observe the same plants year after year are more likely to recognize patterns of growth and reproduction. They become experts not merely in finding resources, but in understanding how those resources behave over time. Knowledge becomes increasingly localized. At the same time, villages create new vulnerabilities. A mobile community can often escape local resource shortages by relocating. A settled community has fewer options. Dependence on nearby resources grows stronger. If local conditions deteriorate, the consequences become more serious. This tension between stability and vulnerability will shape much of the coming transition. The village offers advantages. It also creates risks. The balance remains manageable for now because most people still rely heavily on hunting, gathering, and fishing. Mobility has diminished but not disappeared. Communities retain flexibility. Wild resources continue to provide the foundation of survival. The old world remains intact. Yet something important has changed. For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity adapts itself to the landscape. Now, in subtle ways, the landscape is beginning to adapt to humanity as well. The first villages stand at the center of this transformation. They are not agricultural settlements. They are not cities. They are not the beginning of civilization in the conventional sense. They are something more intriguing. They are places where hunter-gatherers begin experimenting, often unknowingly, with a different relationship to time, place, and resources. The people living there remain members of the ancient foraging world, but every year they stay a little longer. Every generation leaves a few more traces behind. And with each passing century, the distance between a village of hunter-gatherers and a village of farmers grows slightly smaller. The change remains invisible to those experiencing it. History, however, can already see the direction of travel. The seeds that change the world are not planted intentionally, at least not at first. Long before anyone thinks of agriculture as a system, people are already surrounded by plants that possess extraordinary potential. Wild grasses sway across hillsides. Dense stands of cereal grains grow in favorable valleys. Legumes mature in predictable seasons. Nuts accumulate in forests. Tubers lie hidden beneath the soil. For countless generations, these plants serve as resources to be gathered. The relationship appears simple. Humans harvest what nature provides. Nature continues largely unchanged. Yet beneath this familiar pattern, a subtle transformation is beginning. The people living in the last generations before farming know plants intimately. Their survival depends upon it. They recognize which species are edible, which are poisonous, which become useful only after careful preparation, and which provide medicine, fibers, dyes, or fuel. Modern societies often underestimate the scale of this knowledge. In some traditional hunter-gatherer communities documented by anthropologists, individuals possess detailed understanding of hundreds of plant species. They know flowering cycles, growing conditions, seasonal variations, and the locations where specific resources can be found. The last generation before farming inherits similar expertise. This knowledge allows them to see possibilities invisible to outsiders. A patch of wild grain is not merely vegetation. It is food. It is predictability. It is security. When communities begin spending longer periods in particular locations, these resources become increasingly important. Instead of encountering plants briefly during seasonal movements, people observe them repeatedly over months and years. Patterns become easier to notice. Seeds dropped near campsites sometimes sprout unexpectedly. Disturbed ground occasionally produces dense growth. Certain species appear to thrive in areas affected by human activity. Most likely, nobody immediately interprets these observations as the foundation of agriculture. They are simply facts about the landscape. Yet facts accumulate. And accumulated facts sometimes lead to profound changes. Archaeologists examining ancient settlements frequently discover evidence that people are collecting enormous quantities of wild grains before true farming emerges. grinding stones become common. Storage facilities expand. Harvesting tools show signs of extensive use. The scale of collection is striking. In some regions, wild cereals provide such reliable returns that they become major components of local diets. This development creates a fascinating situation. Communities remain hunter-gatherers, but they are increasingly dependent upon resources that resemble future agricultural crops. The line separating gathering from cultivation becomes surprisingly thin. Imagine a group returning year after year to the same productive valley. They harvest wild grain during each season. They remove competing vegetation while collecting seeds. Some seeds inevitably fall near campsites or along frequently used pathways. Without realizing it, people may be influencing plant distribution. The process requires no grand plan, no deliberate invention, only repeated interaction. Over generations, small effects accumulate. Researchers studying the origins of agriculture often emphasize this gradualism. Domestication is not a single event. It is a long process involving countless human actions, most of which probably seem insignificant at the time. A person drops seeds while carrying them. A family clears vegetation around a campsite. A community harvests one area more intensively than another. None of these activities constitutes farming. Together, however, they begin altering relationships between humans and plants. The plants themselves play an important role in the story. Certain species possess characteristics that make them especially suitable for domestication. Wild wheat and barley, for example, produce edible seeds rich in nutrients. They grow in dense stands. Their life cycles are relatively predictable. Yet wild plants are not designed for human convenience. Many naturally disperse their seeds efficiently when mature. From the plant's perspective, scattering seeds across the landscape is a successful reproductive strategy. From a human perspective, it complicates harvesting. Over time, human harvesting practices may unintentionally favor plants whose seeds remain attached longer. Such plants are easier to collect. Generation after generation, subtle selection pressures begin operating. The evidence remains complex, and scholars continue debating details of the process. What survives in the archaeological and genetic records suggests that domestication unfolds gradually over centuries and sometimes millennia. Nobody wakes up one morning to discover agriculture. Instead, communities slowly move along a continuum between wild resource use and deliberate cultivation. The pace is so slow that participants rarely notice. A grandparent and grandchild may experience slightly different relationships with local plants, yet neither perceives a revolution. Only archaeology, with the benefit of thousands of years of hindsight, reveals the magnitude of the transformation. Storage becomes increasingly important during this period. Harvesting large quantities of grain creates opportunities unavailable with many other foods. Properly stored seeds can remain edible for extended periods. Surpluses become possible. The implications are profound. Stored food reduces dependence on immediate foraging success. It provides insurance against poor seasons. It supports larger populations. It encourages longer residence in fixed locations. Every successful harvest strengthens the appeal of remaining near productive resources. Gradually, the logic of settlement and the logic of plant management begin reinforcing one another. One encourages the other. The cycle grows stronger with each generation, yet the process remains far from inevitable. Many communities around the world never adopt agriculture despite possessing extensive plant knowledge. Others experiment with cultivation only to abandon it. Environmental conditions, social structures, cultural traditions, and local opportunities all influence outcomes. No single explanation accounts for every case. Human history is rarely that simple. What makes the regions approaching agriculture so remarkable is not merely the presence of useful plants. Useful plants exist in many places. Rather, it is the convergence of multiple factors: stable climates, growing populations, long-term settlements, extensive ecological knowledge, reliable wild resources. Each element reinforces the others. Together they create conditions in which cultivation becomes increasingly attractive. The people living through this transition cannot see the larger pattern. They remain focused on immediate realities: food for the coming season, repairs to shelters, care for children, preparation for winter. The ordinary concerns of daily life continue much as they always have, and yet subtle changes are unfolding within those routines. A child learns which stands of grain produce the best harvests. An elder notices that certain plants appear more abundant near old campsites. Families devote increasing effort to collecting and storing seeds. Communities begin organizing seasonal activities around predictable plant resources. The world is shifting one observation at a time. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the story is how modest its beginnings appear. Future civilizations will depend upon agriculture. Empires will rise from agricultural surpluses. Cities' writing systems, states' armies, and monumental architecture will eventually emerge from foundations laid by food production. Yet the origins of that immense transformation lie in small acts repeated countless times. A hand gathering grain, a seed falling to the ground, a family returning to the same valley, a community storing food for another season. History often remembers dramatic moments. The birth of agriculture offers something different. It emerges not from a single breakthrough, but from thousands of ordinary decisions accumulating across generations. The last generation before farming stands directly beside this process. They are not yet farmers. They still belong to the ancient world of hunting, gathering, and fishing. But every season brings them into closer relationship with plants that will one day reshape human civilization. The seeds remain wild, the people remain foragers. The future, however, is beginning to take root. The longer people remain in one place, the more that place begins to change them. For generations, settlement has offered clear advantages. Reliable access to resources reduces uncertainty. Storage protects against seasonal shortages. Familiar surroundings provide security. Social networks become stronger when families remain close together. Yet permanence carries costs that are not immediately obvious. The first villages discover this slowly. At first, larger settlements seem like natural extensions of successful hunter-gatherer life. More people can gather in productive regions. More knowledge can be shared. More resources can be processed and stored. The arrangement works remarkably well, until it begins creating problems that mobility once solved. A mobile group leaves behind waste-depleted resources and local tensions. Movement allows the landscape time to recover. It allows people to spread out. It creates distance when conflicts arise. Permanent settlements remove many of these escape routes. The consequences appear gradually. Archaeological sites occupied for long periods often contain enormous accumulations of refuse. Animal bones, broken tools, ash food remains, and discarded materials build up year after year. What once dispersed naturally across large territories now concentrates around villages. The accumulation reveals a fundamental shift. Human impact on the environment is becoming increasingly localized and increasingly intense. For the first time in history, significant numbers of people are living continuously within relatively small areas. This concentration affects both landscapes and social relationships. Nearby resources experience heavier pressure. Firewood becomes more difficult to obtain close to settlements. Hunting may require longer journeys. Frequently harvested plants may decline in abundance. Communities respond through adaptation. They organize labor more efficiently. They exploit a wider variety of resources. They improve storage techniques. They invest more effort in maintaining local productivity. These responses succeed for a time, yet they require increasing levels of coordination. Life is becoming more organized. Perhaps more importantly, life is becoming more dependent upon organization. A family living within a larger settlement cannot function entirely on its own. Shared spaces must be maintained. Collective decisions matter. Access to resources becomes linked to community relationships. The social world grows denser. Anthropologists often note that hunter-gatherer societies possess sophisticated systems for managing cooperation. Sharing food, maintaining alliances, and resolving disputes are essential survival skills. As settlements expand, these systems face new challenges. Larger populations create more opportunities for disagreement. Competition over resources becomes more significant. Personal conflicts become harder to avoid. The archaeological record offers only glimpses of these developments, but some clues survive. Burials occasionally differ in ways that suggest emerging social distinctions. Certain individuals receive unusual treatment. Particular structures appear more prominent than others. Valuable objects may cluster in specific contexts. Scholars still debate exactly what these patterns mean. The evidence remains incomplete. However, many researchers suspect that increasing settlement encourages forms of social complexity that become more common in agricultural societies later on. The village is doing more than changing where people live. It is changing how people relate to one another. This transformation extends into family life as well. Mobile hunter-gatherer groups often limit the amount of material possessions they accumulate. Carrying large quantities of belongings during seasonal movements is impractical. Settled communities face fewer restrictions. Objects accumulate. Tools multiply. Storage containers become important. Buildings require maintenance. Property begins to matter in new ways. The implications are subtle but profound. When resources remain in one place, questions emerge. Who controls them? Who inherits them? Who decides how they are used? These questions become increasingly important as communities invest more labor into fixed locations. The answers vary across cultures and regions. No universal pattern exists, yet the trend is unmistakable. Permanent settlement creates social issues that mobility rarely encounters. At the same time, larger villages provide opportunities unavailable to smaller groups. Specialized skills become more valuable. Some individuals may spend more time crafting tools. Others become experts in food processing, construction ritual activities, or resource management. Knowledge itself becomes increasingly differentiated. The growing complexity of settlement encourages growing complexity of society. None of this happens overnight. The process unfolds across centuries. Most people living through it probably perceive only ordinary life. Children are born. Families grow. Homes are repaired. Food is gathered. The village simply exists. Only from a distant perspective does the cumulative transformation become visible. Health offers another window into the changing world. Permanent settlements bring people into closer contact with one another. Greater density can facilitate the spread of infectious disease. Waste accumulation may affect sanitation. Dependence upon local resources can sometimes reduce dietary diversity. The evidence varies considerably from place to place. Some communities remain healthy and prosperous. Others experience signs of nutritional stress or disease. The pattern is not uniform. What emerges instead is a more complicated picture. Settlement creates benefits and vulnerabilities simultaneously. It increases security in some ways while introducing new risks in others. The balance remains uncertain. The people living through these changes are conducting one of humanity's greatest social experiments without realizing it. Can larger populations remain together successfully? Can resources be managed sustainably in fixed locations? Can communities maintain cooperation as they grow? The answers are still being discovered. One of the most fascinating aspects of this era is how deeply human behavior begins influencing future possibilities. The decision to remain near productive resources encourages storage. Storage encourages settlement. Settlement encourages population growth. Population growth increases pressure on resources. Resource pressure encourages new forms of management. Each development reinforces the next. The cycle gains momentum. By now, the last generation before farming inhabits a world that differs markedly from that of their distant ancestors. They still rely on wild resources. They still possess extraordinary ecological knowledge. They still belong fundamentally to the hunter-gatherer tradition. Yet many are no longer highly mobile. Many live in settlements that persist across generations. Many depend upon stored foods and carefully managed local resources. The distinction between forager and farmer remains real, but it is becoming narrower. Some communities may not even recognize how much they have changed. Human beings adapt gradually. What feels revolutionary to historians often feels ordinary to those experiencing it. A child raised in a permanent settlement accepts its routines as normal. The storage pits have always been there. The houses have always stood in familiar places. The surrounding landscape has always provided food. Daily life appears stable. Yet beneath that appearance, fundamental shifts are underway. The village is teaching humanity new habits. Patience, planning, investment, attachment to place, management of local resources. These lessons will prove essential in the centuries ahead. Agriculture has not yet arrived. Fields do not dominate the landscape. Wild resources remain central to survival. The old world continues, but every season spent in one place strengthens connections that once would have been temporary. Every generation born into village life grows slightly more accustomed to permanence, and permanence more than any invention or discovery may be preparing humanity for what comes next. The first animal to change human history may not have been domesticated because anyone intended to tame it. It may simply have lingered near a campfire. Long before fields cover valleys and long before herds fill fenced pastures, human beings live among animals in relationships far more complex than simple hunting. The world of the last generation before farming is crowded with creatures that provide food, clothing tools, fuel and knowledge. Animal bones become needles, hides become shelter, sinew becomes cordage, antler becomes equipment. Entire ways of life depend upon understanding the habits of other species. People know animals intimately. Hunters learn migration routes that stretch across hundreds of kilometers. Fishers understand seasonal spawning patterns. Gatherers recognize how birds, insects, and mammals signal environmental changes. The boundary between human life and animal life is often much thinner than modern societies imagine. In many places, survival depends upon paying constant attention to the behavior of other creatures. The first major transformation in this relationship may already have begun. The evidence points most strongly toward dogs. Exactly when wolves begin becoming dogs remains a subject of ongoing research. The process likely unfolds over thousands of years and may occur in more than one region. What seems increasingly clear is that by the time many communities stand on the threshold of agriculture, dogs are already accompanying human beings. The story is extraordinary because it unfolds before farming. Dogs are not products of agricultural civilization. They emerge within the hunter-gatherer world. At some point, certain wolves discover advantages in living near human settlements. Camps generate food scraps. Human activity creates opportunities. The least fearful wolves gain access to new resources. Over many generations, selection favors animals more comfortable around people. Humans benefit as well. Dogs provide warning against predators and strangers. They assist in hunting. They offer companionship. They become partners in survival. The relationship develops gradually. No single moment marks the transition. No one decides to invent the dog. Instead, two intelligent social species slowly adapt to one another. By the time the last generation before farming appears, this partnership may already be thousands of years old. It offers humanity an important lesson. Animals can become more than prey. They can become allies. This realization will matter greatly in the future. For now, however, most animals remain wild. The landscapes surrounding villages and camps still contain immense herds, flocks and populations that operate entirely beyond human control. Gazelles move across grasslands. Wild cattle roam open country. Boar forage through forests. Birds fill wetlands. Fish migrate through rivers and coastal waters. These creatures remain essential sources of food. Yet the growing permanence of settlements is beginning to alter the relationship. When communities occupy the same locations year after year, animals must adapt to human presence. Some species avoid settlements, others are attracted to them. Small scavengers discover opportunities among accumulated waste. Birds feed on discarded food. Rodents exploit storage areas. Certain animals thrive in environments modified by human activity. The village is creating a new ecological niche. This niche did not exist during highly mobile phases of human history. Permanent settlement generates concentrated resources that attract wildlife. The consequences are subtle but significant. For perhaps the first time, some animal populations begin living in close association with human communities. The process is not domestication, not yet, but it establishes conditions under which domestication can eventually occur. Archaeologists studying early settlements often uncover evidence that people are paying increasing attention to particular species. Hunting patterns become more selective. Certain animals appear more frequently in archaeological deposits. Age profiles within animal remains suggest changing management strategies. Interpreting these clues is difficult. The evidence remains incomplete. Scholars still debate exactly when hunting transitions into herd management, and when herd management becomes domestication. The boundaries are rarely clear. What survives in the record suggests a long continuum rather than a sudden breakthrough. Consider a community that relies heavily upon wild gazelles. Hunters understand migration routes, breeding seasons, and herd behavior. They observe these animals constantly. Their survival depends upon detailed knowledge accumulated over generations. Such familiarity creates opportunities. People begin recognizing which habitats support the largest herds. They learn how human actions influence animal movement. They understand reproductive cycles with increasing precision. Knowledge becomes a foundation for control. Not immediately, not intentionally, but potentially. The same principle applies to other species that later become domesticated. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs all exist as wild animals long before they become livestock. Human communities interact with them for countless generations before true domestication emerges. The last generation before farming occupies a fascinating position within this process. They possess extraordinary expertise regarding animal behavior, yet most still view animals primarily through the lens of hunting. The future remains invisible. A hunter pursuing wild goats across rocky hillsides cannot imagine vast pastoral societies managing thousands of descendants of those same animals. A fisher harvesting seasonal runs cannot foresee future economies built around domesticated herds. The world remains fundamentally wild, and yet signs of change are appearing. One of the most important developments involves predictability. Communities increasingly value resources that can be anticipated and managed. Wild grain offers predictable harvests. Permanent settlements provide predictable locations. Certain animal populations become increasingly predictable as well. Predictability reduces risk. Reducing risk becomes increasingly important as populations grow. The logic is simple. A larger community requires more reliable food supplies. Reliability encourages planning. Planning encourages management. Management encourages greater human influence over plants and animals. Each step seems practical. Each step seems reasonable. Together they create conditions favorable to domestication. The ecological effects of settlement continue deepening. Animals adjust their movements around villages. Hunting pressure shapes population structures. Human waste alters food availability. Landscapes near settlements become different from landscapes farther away. The process resembles an invisible conversation between species. Humans change the environment. Animals respond. Their responses create new opportunities. Humans respond in turn. Over centuries, these interactions accumulate. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this era is that nobody understands where the path leads. The people living through these changes are not attempting to redesign nature. They're trying to survive, prosper, and protect their families. Their decisions are local, immediate, practical. History gives those decisions larger meaning only in retrospect. A dog resting beside a fire seems unimportant. A settlement attracting scavenging animals seems ordinary. A hunter studying herd movements appears engaged in a timeless activity. Yet within such ordinary scenes lie the foundations of future transformations. Agriculture will eventually alter humanity's relationship with plants. Pastoralism will alter humanity's relationship with animals. Both developments begin long before they become visible as historical revolutions. The last generation before farming stands directly beside that threshold. Their world still belongs to wild creatures. The forests, rivers, grasslands, and coastlines remain filled with animals living according to ancient patterns. But those patterns are beginning to intersect with human settlements in new ways. Some species are learning to live near people. People are learning how predictable certain species can become. Knowledge is deepening. Connections are strengthening. And somewhere within those evolving relationships, another great transition is quietly preparing to emerge. If agriculture eventually transforms the world, the question remains, why does it begin at all? For generations, archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians have wrestled with this problem. The evidence is abundant enough to reveal broad patterns, yet incomplete enough to leave room for debate. The transition from hunting and gathering to farming appears so significant in hindsight that many people assume its causes must be obvious. They are not. In fact, one of the most fascinating aspects of the story is that no single explanation fully accounts for it. The last generation before farming stands at the center of a mystery that scholars continue discussing today. One possibility seems straightforward: population growth. As human numbers increase, communities place greater pressure on local resources. Hunting becomes more intensive. Gathering expands. Productive territories become increasingly valuable. In this view, agriculture emerges because traditional methods eventually struggle to support growing populations. The theory possesses considerable evidence. Many regions approaching agricultural transitions show signs of increasing settlement density. Archaeological sites become more numerous. Communities occupy favorable locations more intensively. Resource use broadens. The logic appears compelling. More people require more food. Food production offers a solution, yet the explanation remains incomplete. Many hunter-gatherer societies successfully support substantial populations without adopting agriculture. Some productive coastal and riverine communities thrive for long periods while continuing to rely on wild resources. Population pressure matters, but it cannot explain everything. Another theory focuses on environmental change. Climate shift alter ecosystems. Droughts affect plant communities. Variations in rainfall influence resource availability. Perhaps agriculture emerges because people adapt to changing environmental conditions. There is evidence supporting this idea as well. Events such as the Younger Dryas create periods of climatic stress in certain regions. Communities may respond by intensifying resource management. Cultivation could represent one strategy for coping with uncertainty. Again, however, the picture remains more complicated. Environmental change occurs repeatedly throughout human history. Most climatic disruptions do not produce agriculture. Some regions experience substantial environmental shifts without developing farming at all. Climate plays a role. Yet climate alone is insufficient. Other scholars emphasize human innovation. People are naturally curious. They experiment. They observe patterns. They develop new technologies. Agriculture may emerge because communities gradually discover more effective ways of obtaining food. This explanation highlights an important truth. The people living before farming are extraordinarily knowledgeable. They understand plants. They understand animals. They understand landscapes. The transition to cultivation does not require ignorance to be replaced by knowledge. It requires existing knowledge to be applied in new ways. Still, innovation alone leaves unanswered questions. Human beings have always been inventive. Why does agriculture emerge in specific places and times rather than everywhere simultaneously? The mystery persists. Increasingly, many researchers favor explanations that combine multiple factors. Population growth creates pressure. Climate stability creates opportunity. Permanent settlements encourage resource management. Ecological knowledge provides necessary expertise. Together, these conditions make cultivation increasingly attractive. The interaction between forces may matter more than any individual cause. History often works this way. Major transformations rarely arise from a single source. Instead, numerous influences converge until change becomes possible. The last generation before farming inhabits precisely such a moment. Everything is aligning. Not perfectly, not universally, but sufficiently. One revealing clue lies in the pace of the transition itself. Agriculture does not spread instantly after it appears. The process often unfolds across centuries or even millennia. Communities experiment. Some adopt cultivation partially. Others continue relying heavily on hunting and gathering. Different strategies coexist. If farming were obviously superior in every respect, adoption would likely occur much faster. Instead, the archaeological record reveals hesitation, experimentation, variation, choice. Many people continue living successfully as foragers long after neighboring communities begin cultivating crops. This fact deserves attention. The last generation before farming is not standing at the edge of an inevitable revolution. They are standing amid competing possibilities. Different ways of life remain viable. Different futures remain available. That reality helps explain why the transition unfolds unevenly across the world. Agriculture appears independently in several regions, including parts of the Near East, China, New Guinea, Mesoamerica, South America, and Africa. Each case involves different crops, different environmental conditions, and different cultural traditions. The similarities are striking. The differences are equally important. No universal formula exists. Human societies arrive at food production through multiple pathways. The diversity of these pathways suggests that agriculture is neither an accident nor a predetermined destiny. It is an adaptation, one among many possible adaptations. What makes the period before farming so remarkable is the balance that still exists. Hunter-gatherer communities remain extraordinarily successful. Many enjoy diverse diets. Many possess flexible social systems. Many maintain close relationships with their environments. The advantages of foraging are real. The advantages of farming are not yet fully visible. Indeed, some early farmers may experience harder lives than their hunter-gatherer neighbors. Agriculture often demands greater labor. Fields require attention. Crops create dependence upon seasonal success. Food surpluses can support larger populations, but they also increase vulnerability to failure. The first farmers are not stepping into an obvious paradise. They are accepting new risks in exchange for new opportunities. The decision, whether conscious or gradual, is more complex than older narratives once suggested. Another important factor involves time. Foraging societies typically focus on resources already available within ecosystems. Agriculture requires investment in the future. Seeds are planted months before harvest. Labor is expended long before rewards appear. This orientation toward delayed returns represents a significant shift. Permanent settlements help make it possible. Storage encourages planning. Planning encourages further investment. Communities become increasingly accustomed to thinking beyond immediate needs. The psychological dimension is difficult to detect archaeologically, yet it may be crucial. People are learning to shape the future rather than simply respond to the present. Perhaps no single explanation can ever fully account for the origins of agriculture, because the transition emerges from countless individual decisions. Families choose where to settle. Communities decide which resources to prioritize. Hunters alter their strategies. Gatherers experiment with plants. Elders pass knowledge to children. Each action seems small, Together they transform the world. What survives in the archaeological record is the accumulated result of those choices. The details remain partly hidden, the evidence remains incomplete. Scholars continue debating interpretations because the transition itself is extraordinarily complex, and complexity may be the real answer. Agriculture does not arise because one thing changes. It arises because many things change simultaneously. Climate, population, settlement, knowledge, resource management, social organization, human expectations. All of these forces interact. All of them contribute. The last generation before farming cannot see the entire web surrounding them. They experience only daily life, the gathering of food, the maintenance of homes, the rhythms of community. Yet every year the pressures grow slightly stronger. The opportunities become slightly clearer. The balance shifts a little further. The old world still functions. The wild landscape still provides. The hunter-gatherer tradition remains strong. But beneath the surface, conditions are converging toward a turning point. Humanity is approaching a choice that will not feel like a choice at all. And once that choice begins unfolding, the world will never be quite the same again. The first fields do not appear overnight. There is no morning when humanity awakens as hunter-gatherers and goes to sleep as farmers. The transition unfolds so slowly that entire lifetimes pass without anyone recognizing the magnitude of what is happening. A person born into the old world may die believing that life remains essentially unchanged, even as subtle transformations accumulate around them. Yet eventually the evidence becomes unmistakable. In a handful of regions, people begin doing something their ancestors never practiced on a meaningful scale. They start helping plants grow. At first, the distinction is almost impossible to see. Communities continue harvesting wild resources. Hunting remains important. Fishing continues. Gathering remains central to survival. Cultivation represents only one activity among many. The old world still dominates daily life, but the balance is shifting. Archaeologists studying ancient plant remains can often trace this shift through tiny clues preserved in the ground. Seeds recovered from settlements begin displaying characteristics associated with domestication. Certain species become more common. Storage facilities expand. Tools used for harvesting and processing plant foods increase in number. The evidence accumulates gradually, generation by generation, century by century. One of the most important developments involves deliberate planting. At some point, people realize that seeds placed in favorable locations can produce useful harvests. The insight may seem obvious from a modern perspective, but its consequences are extraordinary. A gathered resource becomes a managed resource. A wild landscape becomes in part a designed landscape. For the first time in human history, significant numbers of people begin investing labor into shaping future food supplies directly. The innovation does not immediately replace foraging. Far from it. Early cultivation often supplements traditional activities rather than eliminating them. Communities continue hunting game. They continue gathering wild plants. They continue exploiting rivers, forests, and coastlines. Agriculture begins as an addition, not a replacement. This hybrid phase may persist for centuries. The pace varies from region to region. Some communities embrace cultivation more extensively than others. Some experiment and retreat. Others gradually deepen their commitment. The process resembles a slow negotiation between old and new ways of life. The archaeological record reveals this negotiation in fascinating detail. Certain settlements contain evidence of both domesticated and wild resources. Hunting remains significant even as cultivation expands. Storage facilities coexist with traditional tools. New practices emerge alongside ancient ones. The future arrives unevenly. One family may rely heavily on cultivated grain. Another may continue depending primarily on hunting and gathering. The landscape itself reflects this mixture. Fields remain small. Wild habitats still dominate. Most people would not yet recognize the beginning of an agricultural world. Yet important changes are already underway. Perhaps the most significant involves reliability. Wild resources can be abundant, but they remain fundamentally unpredictable. Weather affects plant growth, animal populations fluctuate, migration patterns shift, cultivated crops offer something different. They cannot eliminate uncertainty, but they can increase control. A community that plants seeds gains some influence over future food supplies. That influence is limited. Drought can still destroy crops. Floods can still devastate harvests. Nature remains powerful. Even so, the relationship between humans and food is changing. People are becoming producers rather than solely collectors. This shift alters how communities think about land. A hunter-gatherer may value territory because it contains useful resources. A cultivator values land because it can be transformed into future resources. The distinction is subtle. Historically, it is enormous. Land begins acquiring new significance. Certain locations become especially desirable. Fertile soils matter. Access to water becomes increasingly important. Investment in particular places deepens. Communities that cultivate crops often find themselves tied more closely to specific territories. The roots of permanence grow deeper still. Labor changes as well. Foraging requires skill, knowledge, and effort. Agriculture introduces different demands. Land must be prepared. Seeds must be planted. Crops must be protected. Harvests must be processed and stored. The work is seasonal but often intensive. Skeletal evidence from early farming communities sometimes reveals signs of repetitive strain and physical stress. Researchers frequently observe changes suggesting increased labor compared with some hunter-gatherer populations. The first fields are not effortless sources of abundance. They require commitment. The rewards, however, can be substantial. Successful harvests generate surpluses. Surpluses support larger populations. Larger populations support more permanent settlements. The cycle that has been building for generations gains momentum. Children born into communities practicing cultivation experience a slightly different world from their grandparents. They grow up expecting seasonal planting. They become familiar with managed landscapes. They learn skills their ancestors never possessed. The transformation is cultural as well as economic. Knowledge itself is changing. New traditions emerge. New responsibilities appear. New relationships develop between people and the land. At the same time, uncertainty remains. Agriculture is still an experiment. No one knows where it will lead. Communities adopting cultivation cannot foresee cities, states, empires, or industrial societies. They are solving immediate problems using available knowledge. History grants their actions greater significance only in retrospect. One particularly intriguing aspect of the transition is how domesticated plants themselves begin evolving alongside humans. Wild cereals gradually develop traits favored by cultivation. Seeds that remain attached longer become easier to harvest. Plants that thrive in disturbed soils benefit from human activity. A partnership is forming. Humans influence plants. Plants influence humans. Each shapes the evolution of the other. This mutual transformation becomes one of the defining features of the agricultural world. Yet the old world refuses to disappear quietly. Wild resources continue providing enormous value. Hunting remains important in many regions for thousands of years. Fishing communities thrive. Gathering traditions persist. The rise of agriculture is not a sudden conquest. It is a prolonged coexistence. Different ways of life share the landscape. Different strategies compete and interact. The last generation before farming stands immediately before this coexistence becomes visible. Their children may witness the first cultivated plots. Their grandchildren may regard them as ordinary. Their descendants may eventually struggle to imagine a world without them. That is how profound transformations often occur. Not through dramatic announcements, not through single inventions, but through repeated actions becoming habits and habits becoming traditions. A family plants seeds, another observes the results. A community expands cultivation slightly. A settlement grows larger. A harvest succeeds. Then another, and another. Over time, the accumulation becomes impossible to reverse. The first fields remain modest by later standards. They cover only small portions of the landscape. Yet within those fields lies a future that will reshape humanity more completely than almost any previous development. The age of pure foraging is approaching its end. Not everywhere, not immediately, but unmistakably. The first cultivated ground has appeared, and with it the world begins turning toward a new direction from which there will be no return. The first harvest changes more than food. It changes people, not all at once and not in every place, but steadily enough that archaeologists can trace its effects through bones, settlements, tools, and the silent layers of earth that preserve fragments of ancient lives. The transformation begins with daily routines. A hunter-gatherer world is shaped by movement, observation, and flexibility. Food comes from many sources. Knowledge is spread across landscapes. Survival depends upon understanding changing conditions. Agriculture introduces a different rhythm. The year becomes increasingly organized around the needs of crops. Planting season arrives. Fields require attention. Harvest approaches. Food storage becomes critical. The calendar itself begins to revolve around cultivation. This new rhythm affects everyone. Children learn different skills. Adults divide labor in new ways. Communities become more dependent upon cooperation. The change may appear subtle at first, yet it gradually alters how people experience time. For foragers, resources often appear when nature provides them. For farmers, resources depend increasingly upon preparation months in advance. Patience becomes essential. Planning becomes indispensable. The future acquires greater importance. The effects reach into the body itself. One of the most surprising discoveries made by archaeologists concerns health during the agricultural transition. Many people assume that food production automatically improves living conditions. The evidence tells a more complicated story. Early farming often supports larger populations, but individual health does not always improve. In some regions, average height declines. Signs of nutritional stress become more common. Dental problems increase. Evidence of infectious disease appears more frequently. These findings have puzzled researchers for decades. How can a development that eventually supports civilization initially produce such mixed results? Part of the answer lies in dietary diversity. Many hunter-gatherers consume a wide range of foods. Fish, game, nuts, fruits, seeds, roots, and numerous other resources contribute nutrients. Early farmers frequently rely more heavily on a limited number of staple crops. The food supply becomes more predictable. It may also become less varied. A successful harvest can feed many people. A poor harvest can create serious problems. Agriculture offers abundance, but it also creates dependence. Communities are increasingly tied to the success of a few key species. This dependence influences settlement patterns as well. Villages continue growing. Some expand into substantial communities. Houses cluster together, storage facilities multiply, population density increases. The archaeological record preserves these developments with remarkable clarity. Sites that once contained dozens of inhabitants eventually support hundreds. Over time, some support even more. The implications are enormous. Larger populations generate larger social networks. They also create new challenges. Conflict becomes more complicated. Leadership may become more important. Resource distribution requires greater coordination. The foundations of future social hierarchies begin emerging. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate exactly when significant inequalities first appear. Yet many researchers believe that food surpluses play a crucial role. Surpluses can be accumulated. Accumulated resources can be controlled. Control creates opportunities for differences in wealth and influence. The process is gradual. It unfolds unevenly across regions. Still, the direction is becoming increasingly clear. Agriculture is changing not only economies but social structures. Family life may be changing as well. Permanent settlements often encourage larger populations. Food storage provides greater stability. Children can contribute labor within agricultural households. Over generations, demographic patterns shift. The world becomes more crowded. What began as scattered villages gradually evolves into networks of expanding communities. The transformation affects the landscape too. Fields replace portions of wild habitats. Trees are cleared. Soil is disturbed repeatedly. Water is redirected. Human activity begins shaping ecosystems on a scale previously unknown. For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity adapts itself to nature. Now nature is increasingly adapting to humanity. The process remains limited compared with later civilizations, yet its significance is unmistakable. The relationship between people and the environment has entered a new phase. One particularly fascinating consequence involves memory. Hunter-gatherer knowledge often emphasizes movement through landscapes. Stories connect rivers, mountains, migration routes, and seasonal resources. Agricultural communities retain many traditions from the old world, but new priorities emerge. Knowledge of fields becomes essential. Planting schedules matter. Storage practices matter. Property boundaries may matter. Information increasingly centers on fixed locations rather than seasonal journeys. Culture evolves alongside economy. The transition is not simply about food. It is about how people organize reality. Archaeologists occasionally discover evidence of ritual activities associated with early farming communities. Ceremonial structures appear. Burials continue. Symbolic traditions persist. Agriculture does not erase older beliefs. Instead, ancient traditions adapt to changing circumstances. The spiritual world changes alongside the material one. People remain connected to ancestors. They remain connected to landscapes. Yet those landscapes are no longer entirely wild. Human labor has become part of them. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the transition is how ordinary it feels to those living through it. A family planting crops does not imagine that it is participating in a revolution. Parents focus on feeding children. Communities focus on surviving another year. The future remains invisible. History's greatest transformations often appear mundane in the moment. The first farmers do not know they are creating conditions for cities. They do not know they are laying foundations for states writing systems and empires. They are solving immediate problems using available knowledge. Yet every successful harvest strengthens a new system. Every generation raised within agricultural communities grows more accustomed to its logic. The old world begins receding, not disappearing. Not yet, but slowly moving farther into the past. Still, the transition remains incomplete. Many people continue hunting and gathering. Many communities maintain mixed economies. Wild resources remain valuable. The ancient skills survive. The age of foragers has not ended. What exists instead is a world in between. A world where old traditions and new practices coexist. A world where villages contain both hunters and cultivators. A world where children learn inherited knowledge from thousands of years of foraging history, while also mastering techniques unknown to their distant ancestors. This coexistence will continue for generations. It may even continue for millennia in some regions. Yet the momentum is unmistakable. Agriculture is no longer an experiment confined to a few fields. It is becoming a way of life. And as that way of life spreads, the final generation born entirely into the ancient foraging world draws ever closer. The people standing at that threshold do not know it, but they are witnessing the beginning of humanity's most profound social transformation. The old world does not surrender quickly. Even as fields spread across certain valleys and cultivated plants become increasingly important, vast numbers of people continue living as their ancestors have lived for thousands of generations. They hunt, they fish, they gather, they move with the seasons. They rely upon deep ecological knowledge rather than planted crops. For a very long time, the future belongs to both worlds at once. This is one of the most important realities of the agricultural transition and one of the easiest to overlook. Looking backward from the modern age, agriculture appears unstoppable. Nearly every major civilization eventually depends upon farming. Cities rise from agricultural surpluses, states expand, populations multiply. The outcome seems inevitable. The lived experience is very different. For centuries and sometimes millennia, communities practicing agriculture exist beside communities that continue hunting and gathering. Neither side immediately replaces the other. The archaeological record reveals a landscape of coexistence. In some regions, farming villages cluster along fertile river valleys, while neighboring groups continue exploiting forests, wetlands, coastlines, or grasslands. Different strategies thrive under different conditions. The contrast can be striking. A farming settlement may spend much of the year tending crops, maintaining storage facilities, and managing fixed resources. A nearby hunter-gatherer community may remain highly mobile, drawing food from dozens of different plant and animal species spread across a broad territory. Each way of life possesses strengths. Each carries risks. Neither appears universally superior. This reality helps explain why many communities resist agriculture or adopt it only gradually. The decision is rarely ideological. It is practical. If hunting and gathering continue providing reliable food, why abandon a successful system? Archaeologists and anthropologists have long recognized that some hunter-gatherer societies remain remarkably prosperous. Coastal communities with access to rich fisheries can support substantial populations. River systems produce abundant resources. Forests offer diverse foods throughout the year. In such environments, agriculture may provide few immediate advantages. Indeed, it may initially appear less attractive. Early farming often requires hard labor. Crops demand attention. Harvests remain vulnerable to weather. Dietary diversity may decline. From the perspective of a successful forager, the benefits are not always obvious. This observation challenges older assumptions about human history. Agriculture does not spread because everyone instantly recognizes its superiority. Instead, its expansion reflects a complex mixture of local circumstances. Some communities adopt it eagerly. Others experiment cautiously. Some ignore it for generations. Others reject it entirely. The resulting landscape is extraordinarily diverse. One valley may contain cultivated fields. The next may remain dominated by hunters and gatherers. The boundaries between these worlds are often porous. People trade. Ideas travel. Knowledge spreads. The archaeological evidence increasingly suggests that interaction between farming and foraging communities plays a significant role in shaping history. Stone tools move between regions. Ornaments are exchanged. Marriage networks may connect groups pursuing different economic strategies. The old world and the new world are not isolated from one another. They are intertwined. This interaction creates fascinating possibilities. A hunter-gatherer visiting a farming settlement witnesses unfamiliar practices. Fields occupy portions of the landscape. Storage facilities contain large quantities of food. Daily routines revolve around cultivation. Meanwhile, farmers may observe the flexibility and ecological expertise of neighboring foragers. Each group sees strengths in the other. Each group sees weaknesses as well. The relationship is rarely simple. Sometimes it is cooperative, sometimes competitive. Often it is both. The evidence remains incomplete, but scholars increasingly believe that these interactions help accelerate cultural change. Ideas can spread more quickly than populations. A community does not necessarily need to become farmers to learn about cultivation. Knowledge travels through contact. This process may help explain why agricultural practices expand into new territories over time. Yet even where farming spreads successfully, the old skills remain valuable. Hunters continue providing meat. Fishers continue harvesting rivers and coastlines. Gatherers continue collecting wild foods. Many early agricultural societies rely heavily on resources outside their fields. The distinction between farmer and forager is often less rigid than it appears. People move between strategies when circumstances require. A poor harvest may increase dependence on hunting. Abundant wild resources may supplement agricultural diets. Flexibility remains essential. The ancient wisdom of the foraging world does not disappear simply because crops appear. Indeed, some of that knowledge survives for thousands of years. One of the most intriguing aspects of the transition concerns identity. What does it mean to belong to a community when neighboring groups live fundamentally different lives? The question is difficult to answer archaeologically. Objects survive. Buildings survive. Human thoughts rarely do. Yet cultural differences likely become increasingly visible. Settlements look different. Daily routines differ. Relationships with the landscape diverge. Over time, distinct ways of understanding the world may emerge. The farming village sees land partly as a resource to be managed and transformed. The hunter-gatherer community sees land partly as a network of relationships to be navigated and understood. Neither perspective is entirely exclusive. Yet the emphasis differs. The divergence matters. It represents more than an economic change. It reflects different visions of humanity's place within nature. The last true foragers occupy a unique historical position because they preserve traditions stretching back through nearly all of human existence. Their knowledge links directly to countless generations who survived without agriculture. Their skills represent adaptations refined over hundreds of thousands of years, tracking animals, reading landscapes, understanding seasonal cycles, navigating complex ecosystems. These abilities remain astonishingly sophisticated. Even as farming spreads, they continue proving their value. In some regions, hunter-gatherer communities outlast neighboring agricultural societies. Environmental conditions may favor mobility. Wild resources may remain abundant. Local circumstances may make cultivation less practical. History does not move in a single direction everywhere at once. Different paths remain possible. That is what makes this period so fascinating. The future has not yet fully arrived. Agriculture is growing. Villages are expanding. Fields are becoming more common. Yet the ancient world still breathes. Its traditions remain alive. Its knowledge remains powerful. Its people remain numerous. The final disappearance of the old foraging way of life lies farther ahead than many imagine. For now, humanity occupies two worlds simultaneously. One world is rooted in movement memory and wild landscapes. The other is rooted in settlement cultivation and planned harvests. Both are real, both are successful, and for a brief moment in history they exist side by side beneath the same sky. For generations the two worlds watch one another. Across river valleys, mountain foothills, coastlines, and forest edges, communities living very different lives occupy neighboring landscapes. Some cultivate crops and store harvests. Others continue following seasonal patterns refined across thousands of years. Between them lies one of the most important cultural frontiers in human history. It is not marked by walls. It is not marked by borders. Yet it separates fundamentally different ways of understanding survival. The relationship is rarely simple. Modern discussions sometimes portray the spread of agriculture as a straightforward replacement of one lifestyle by another. The archaeological record suggests something far more complicated. Farming communities and hunter-gatherer groups interact in countless ways. They exchange goods, they exchange ideas, they sometimes compete for territory, they sometimes cooperate. Their histories become intertwined. The evidence for these interactions appears across large portions of the world. In Europe, agriculture gradually spreads from regions where it first develops into territories occupied by hunter-gatherer populations. The process unfolds over centuries. In some areas, local communities adopt farming practices. In others, incoming farmers establish settlements. Frequently, both processes occur simultaneously. The result is not a clean transition. it is a mosaic. Different groups respond differently. Different regions follow different paths. Some hunter-gatherers embrace certain aspects of agriculture while retaining traditional practices. Others maintain their existing lifeways for remarkably long periods. The diversity is striking. Humanity is experimenting with multiple futures at once. Archaeological discoveries increasingly reveal the complexity of these encounters. Farming villages and foraging communities often exchange materials across considerable distances. Stone tools, ornaments, pigments, and other goods move between populations. Trade networks connect people who obtain food in very different ways. These exchanges carry more than objects. They carry knowledge. A hunter-gatherer visiting a farming settlement may observe cultivation techniques. A farmer interacting with foragers may learn about distant landscapes, hunting methods, or valuable wild resources. Ideas travel more easily than populations. Sometimes a technique spreads without large-scale migration. Sometimes entire communities change. The evidence remains incomplete and scholars continue debating details of these processes. Yet one conclusion grows increasingly clear. The agricultural transition is not simply about crops. It is about human relationships. It is about how societies influence one another. Competition also plays a role. As farming populations grow, their settlements often expand. Fields require space. Larger communities consume more resources. Territory becomes increasingly valuable. In certain regions, this expansion may create tensions. The archaeological record occasionally preserves hints of conflict. Defensive structures appear. Signs of violence emerge in skeletal remains. Some settlements occupy naturally protected locations. Interpreting such evidence requires caution. Violence existed long before agriculture. Not every defensive feature indicates warfare. Not every injury reflects organized conflict. The evidence remains fragmentary. Even so, it suggests that competition sometimes accompanies the spread of farming. The reasons are understandable. When two groups depend upon the same landscape in different ways, their interests may not always align. A field occupies territory that might once have supported wild resources. A growing village changes local ecosystems. Expanding populations alter established patterns. The consequences ripple outward. Yet cooperation may be just as important as competition. Many communities likely discover advantages in maintaining connections. Trade creates mutual benefits. Alliances provide security. Shared knowledge improves survival. Human history rarely divides neatly into friends and enemies. Most relationships contain elements of both. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of these encounters involves perception. How do hunter-gatherers view farmers? How do farmers view hunter-gatherers? The archaeological record cannot answer directly. No written accounts survive from this era. The thoughts of the people themselves remain largely hidden. Yet it is reasonable to imagine curiosity. A forager observing cultivated fields witnesses something unfamiliar. Food appears concentrated in specific locations. Labor follows new patterns. Communities remain tied to permanent settlements. A farmer observing hunter-gatherers encounters a different kind of expertise. These people move confidently through landscapes. They understand wild resources in extraordinary detail. They possess flexibility that settled communities often lack. Each side sees strengths. Each side sees limitations. The contrast becomes especially important during periods of environmental stress. A farming community suffering crop failure may benefit from knowledge of wild resources. Hunter-gatherers facing local shortages may find opportunities through exchange with settled neighbors. The coexistence of different lifeways creates resilience at a regional scale. Human diversity becomes a survival strategy. Genetics adds another layer to the story. Advances in ancient DNA research have transformed our understanding of these interactions. In many regions, evidence indicates that populations associated with farming and populations associated with foraging do not remain completely separate. They meet, they intermarry, They exchange ancestry as well as culture. The transition becomes not merely an economic transformation but a biological one. Entire populations blend over time. The descendants of these encounters eventually carry genetic legacies from both worlds. The significance of this process is profound. The spread of agriculture is not simply the story of one group replacing another. More often, it is the story of people meeting, mixing, adapting, and creating new societies together. The old world and the new world become inseparable. Still, the balance is shifting. With each generation, farming communities often grow larger. Agricultural production can support increasing populations. Settlements expand. New villages appear. The demographic advantage becomes difficult to ignore. Hunter-gatherer communities continue surviving successfully in many environments, but the broader trend is becoming visible. Agriculture is spreading, not because it is perfect, not because it guarantees prosperity, but because it allows certain kinds of growth that foraging rarely supports on the same scale. The consequences extend far beyond food production. Larger populations create more complex social structures. More complex societies generate new technologies. New technologies encourage further expansion. The cycle feeds itself. Yet amid all these developments, the ancient world remains alive. Children still learn tracking skills. Hunters still follow animal trails. Fishers still read currents and tides. Gatherers still identify hundreds of useful plants. The wisdom accumulated across hundreds of thousands of years has not vanished. It continues guiding daily life for millions of people. The final chapter of the foraging age has not yet been written, but its ending is approaching. Across growing portions of the world, a different way of life is gaining momentum. The encounter between hunters and farmers is gradually becoming less balanced. One world is expanding, the other is beginning to retreat, and somewhere among those changing landscapes live the last generations who still remember humanity's oldest way of life as the center of the human story, rather than its fading past. No generation knows it is the last. History rarely announces its endings. The final generation before farming does not gather together to mark the conclusion of an age. There are no monuments declaring the end of hundreds of thousands of years of foraging life. No elder stands before a community and explains that an ancient chapter of human existence is closing. Life continues as it always has. People wake before dawn. They tend fires. They prepare tools. They search for food. They teach children. They tell stories. The rhythms feel timeless. That is what makes the transition so difficult to see from within. Yet from the perspective of archaeology, anthropology, and history, something extraordinary is happening. Across increasing portions of the world, individuals are being born into circumstances fundamentally different from those experienced by their ancestors. For perhaps the first time, children are growing up expecting planted food to be part of life. The shift seems small. In reality, it is enormous. For countless generations, every human child enters a world where survival depends upon finding resources that already exist in nature. The landscape provides food and people learn how to locate it. Now gradually another possibility is appearing. The landscape can be altered. Food can be encouraged to grow. The future harvest can be influenced by actions taken months earlier. The idea spreads slowly, but once established, it changes expectations. Children raised in agricultural communities absorb assumptions that would have seemed unfamiliar to distant ancestors. Fields become ordinary. Stored grain becomes ordinary. Permanent villages become ordinary. The new world begins to feel natural. At the same time, the old world remains astonishingly resilient. Many communities continue hunting and gathering successfully. In some regions, they will do so for thousands of years after agriculture first appears elsewhere. The last generation before farming is therefore not a single group of people living in one place. It is a historical condition, a moment experienced repeatedly across different regions as agriculture expands. In one valley, the final generation may live 11,000 years ago. In another region it may live much later. The transition unfolds at different times across the globe, yet the experience contains common themes. The people involved inherit traditions stretching deeper into the past than almost anything that follows. Their skills are products of immense spans of time. Their knowledge reflects countless generations of observation. They know how to read landscapes. They know how to follow migrations. They know how to survive without fields. These abilities represent the culmination of humanity's longest chapter. Sometimes modern discussions of prehistory focus heavily on what hunter-gatherers lacked. They lacked writing, they lacked cities, they lacked large states and monumental architecture. The perspective can be misleading. The final generation before farming also possesses things later societies often struggle to maintain. They possess extraordinary environmental knowledge. They possess flexible survival strategies. They possess close familiarity with ecosystems. They possess cultural traditions refined over hundreds of thousands of years. In many ways, they represent not the beginning of human development, but the mature expression of an ancient and highly successful adaptation. This realization changes how the transition should be understood. Agriculture is not replacing failure. It is replacing success. That success makes the transformation more remarkable. If hunter-gatherer life had been universally unsustainable, the spread of farming would require little explanation. The puzzle exists precisely because foraging works so well for so long. The last generation before farming stands at the point where a successful old system encounters a different successful system. One expands, the other gradually contracts. Neither is inherently simple. Neither is inherently superior in every circumstance. History favors agriculture largely because it supports larger populations and increasingly complex social structures. The outcome becomes visible only over long timescales. Individuals living through the transition cannot see that outcome. They know only their own lives. An elder teaching children to identify edible plants does not realize that some of those children may spend more time tending fields than gathering wild foods. A hunter passing knowledge to younger generations does not know that future descendants may rarely hunt at all. A community preserving ancient traditions cannot know which traditions will survive and which will fade. The future remains hidden. This hidden future gives the period a particular poignancy. Humanity is standing at the threshold of transformation without recognizing the threshold. The old world continues functioning. The new world continues expanding. Both appear normal, yet one possesses a demographic momentum that grows stronger with each generation. Agricultural communities often support larger populations. Larger populations produce more settlements. More settlements spread agricultural practices further. The process accelerates. Not everywhere, not immediately, but steadily enough that the balance gradually changes. The archaeological record captures this shift with increasing clarity. Farming settlements become more numerous. Domesticated plants become more widespread. Evidence of cultivation appears across expanding territories. Meanwhile, purely foraging communities occupy a shrinking proportion of the human landscape. They do not vanish overnight. Far from it. Many endure for centuries. Some endure for millennia. Yet the broader trend becomes difficult to ignore. The center of gravity in human history is moving. What had once been humanity's universal way of life is becoming one possibility among several, then one possibility among fewer, then eventually a minority tradition. The significance of this change extends beyond economics. It alters how humans understand themselves. For most of human history, people belong entirely to the natural rhythms of wild ecosystems. Their lives are deeply integrated with migration patterns, seasonal cycles, and ecological relationships. Agriculture creates a different relationship. Humans begin constructing environments designed around their needs. The distinction marks one of the greatest shifts in the human story. The last generation before farming stands precisely at that boundary. Behind them stretches an immense past, Ahead lies a future filled with villages, towns, cities, kingdoms, and civilizations yet unimagined. They cannot see that future. They cannot know that the descendants of farmers will eventually build monuments, write histories, chart stars, cross oceans, and reshape continents. What they know is the present, the smell of wood smoke, the changing seasons, the familiar landscape, the knowledge passed down from elders, the ordinary details of daily life. History often remembers great transformations through dates, inventions, and events. The agricultural transition reminds us that real change usually happens through people living ordinary lives. The last generation before farming does not set out to transform humanity, yet they stand closer to that transformation than anyone before them. And with every passing season, the ancient world that shaped nearly all of human existence moves a little further away. The traces remain everywhere. Beneath modern cities, beneath farmland, beneath roads, villages, and industrial landscapes, the memory of the old world survives in fragments. A stone blade emerges from a river bank. Charred seeds are recovered from an ancient hearth. Animal bones lie buried beneath layers of sediment. Tiny chemical signatures remain preserved in teeth and skeletons. For centuries, these clues appeared disconnected. Today, they are helping reconstruct one of the most important transitions in human history. The story of the last generation before farming does not end when agriculture spreads. In many ways, it begins there. Their descendants carry the consequences of that transformation into every civilization that follows. Yet the ancient world they leave behind never completely disappears. It survives inside culture, inside biology, inside memory, and increasingly inside science. Archaeology provides the first layer of evidence. Excavations reveal settlements frozen in time. Researchers uncover grinding stones worn smooth by years of use. Storage pits preserve traces of harvested grains. Hearths contain remnants of meals consumed thousands of years ago. Each discovery adds detail to a picture that was once almost invisible. The cumulative result is extraordinary. Humanity's greatest transition did not happen because people suddenly became more intelligent. It did not happen because civilization appeared from nowhere. It emerged from long processes already underway within successful hunter-gatherer societies. The evidence points repeatedly toward continuity rather than abrupt replacement. The skills required for farming come from knowledge developed during the foraging age. The first cultivators are not separate from the people who came before them. They are the same people adapting to changing circumstances. Genetics reinforces this conclusion. Ancient DNA has transformed our understanding of prehistory more dramatically than many researchers once imagined. Tiny fragments of genetic material preserved in ancient remains now allow scientists to trace movements, interactions, and relationships across vast spans of time. The results reveal a world of remarkable complexity. In many regions, populations associated with farming and populations associated with hunting and gathering mix extensively. Communities exchange not only ideas and technologies, but ancestry itself. Modern populations often carry genetic legacies from both traditions. The descendants of farmers and the descendants of foragers become the same people. The boundary that once seemed so significant gradually dissolves. Yet genetic research also reveals something else. The legacy of the foraging world remains deeply embedded within humanity. The people who lived before agriculture are not evolutionary dead ends. They are not forgotten branches cut away from history. They are ancestors. Their adaptations, migrations, and survival strategies shape the genetic foundations of countless populations alive today. The old world still exists within us. Cultural traditions preserve additional echoes. Across different societies, stories, skills, and practices sometimes retain roots reaching astonishing distances into the past. Knowledge of wild plants survives. Hunting traditions endure. Seasonal celebrations reflect rhythms older than recorded history. The connections are rarely direct. Thousands of years of change separate modern societies from the last generation before farming. Even so, traces remain. History leaves fingerprints in unexpected places. Perhaps the most fascinating lesson emerging from modern research concerns humanity's relationship with nature. The agricultural transition is often portrayed as a victory over the natural world. The evidence suggests something more nuanced. Early farmers remain deeply dependent upon environmental conditions. Crops succeed or fail according to weather. Soil fertility matters. Water availability matters. Ecological knowledge remains essential. Agriculture changes humanity's relationship with nature. It does not eliminate it. Indeed, many challenges facing modern societies have roots extending back to that original transition. Questions about resource management, population growth, environmental impact and sustainability first become visible during the shift from foraging to farming. The scale is different today. The underlying themes are familiar. The last generation before farming stands at the beginning of processes that continue shaping the world. This realization helps explain why their story remains relevant. The transition they experience is not merely an ancient historical curiosity. It is one of the foundational events of human existence. Everything that follows depends upon it. Cities depend upon agricultural surpluses. States depend upon concentrated populations. Written records emerge from increasingly complex societies. Technological specialization becomes possible because food production supports people engaged in activities beyond subsistence. The chain of consequences stretches across millennia, and yet the origin remains surprisingly humble. A settlement lasting longer than expected, a storage pit filled with grain, a community returning repeatedly to the same valley, a family planting seeds. The beginnings are small enough to be overlooked. That may be the most important lesson of all. Human history is often imagined as a sequence of dramatic breakthroughs. The evidence from prehistory reveals a different pattern. Transformations emerge through accumulation. Countless ordinary decisions interact across generations until something entirely new appears. The last generation before farming never witnesses the final outcome. They cannot. The world they help create lies thousands of years in the future. They know nothing of empires, writing systems, cathedrals, factories, satellites, or modern cities. They know only their own landscapes, their own communities, their own daily concerns. Yet those ordinary lives become the foundation upon which everything else is built. Standing at the edge of the old world, they embody a remarkable paradox. They are simultaneously the end of one story and the beginning of another. Behind them lies nearly all of human existence. Ahead lies nearly all of recorded history. Few generations occupy such a position. Fewer still remain so invisible. No monuments commemorate them. No written histories preserve their names. The evidence survives only in fragments scattered across the earth. Yet those fragments tell a powerful story. Humanity did not suddenly become civilized. Humanity gradually transformed itself. The last generation before farming reminds us that civilization grows from deep roots planted in a far older world. The skills, knowledge, cooperation, and adaptability that make agriculture possible are products of hundreds of thousands of years of experience. The first farmers inherit that legacy. So do we, and somewhere beneath every field, every town, every city, and every road, the traces of that older world still remain waiting patiently beneath the soil, preserving the memory of the people who stood at the threshold between humanity's longest age and the future that followed. The wind moves across a landscape that no longer exists. Ancient grasslands have become farms, wetlands have been drained, forests have retreated and retreated again. Rivers have shifted their courses, coastlines have advanced and withdrawn. Entire worlds have disappeared beneath rising seas. Yet for a moment it is possible to imagine the old earth as it once was. Small groups move along familiar paths. Fires glow beside rivers. Children learn the names of plants and animals. Hunters watch distant herds crossing open country. Gatherers return with baskets filled from landscapes understood in astonishing detail. Nothing about the scene feels temporary. Nothing suggests an ending. The people living there believe, as most people do, that the world they know will continue. They cannot see the centuries ahead. They cannot see fields spreading across valleys. They cannot see villages becoming towns or towns becoming cities. They cannot see kingdoms, empires, industries, or nations. They know only the rhythms of seasons, the knowledge of elders, and the landscapes that sustain them. And perhaps that is why their story remains so compelling. The last generation before farming stands at one of history's quiet turning points. No great battle marks the transition. No single invention announces the future. Change arrives gradually, almost invisibly, carried through ordinary decisions repeated over generations. A seed planted, a harvest stored, a settlement occupied a little longer than before. The transformation grows from simple acts, yet those acts eventually reshape the human story. Today the world created by that transformation surrounds us. Most people live within societies built upon foundations first laid thousands of years ago. Agriculture supports populations unimaginable to ancient foragers. Cities stretch across landscapes once travelled by hunters and gatherers. The consequences of that distant transition remain woven into everyday life. Still, the older world has not vanished completely. Its memory survives in archaeological traces, in fragments of tradition, in ancient pathways hidden beneath modern roads, and in the enduring human ability to observe, adapt, cooperate, and survive. Those qualities belong to the foraging age. They belong to the people who came before fields, and they remain part of humanity still. As darkness settles across the ancient landscape one final time, the fires burn quietly beneath a sky crowded with stars. The people gathered beside them do not know that they stand at the edge of a new era. They simply live, and in living they carry the old world gently into the future.